In the final years of the Pacific War, the air above Japan was heavy, not just with ash and rumor, but with fear so thick it could be tasted. In schools, women's dormitories, and military hospitals, the same whispers spread like smoke from Tokyo to Saipan. The Americans are beasts. They kill without mercy. They desecrate the bodies of the dead. For the young nurses who volunteered to serve the emperor, these stories were more than propaganda. They were scripture. They were told that capture meant shame worse than death, that surrender was treason against the divine. Among them was a small group of women from Kyushu, dispatched to an island they had barely heard of, Guam. They were trained to bandage, to comfort, and when necessary, to die. Their instructors showed them films of supposed American atrocities, staged scenes of torture, villages burning, and soldiers grinning over corpses. The lights would dim, and the voice of the instructor would echo. Remember this when the enemy comes. They are not men. The young women would bow, trembling, believing. They cut their hair short so they could work faster under the tropical heat. They burned letters from home so the enemy could not use them. Each carried a small glass vial sealed with poison. Their final duty, should capture come. They were told this was honor. They were told this was courage. When the invasion of Guam began in the summer of 1944, the sky itself seemed to fall. The thunder of naval guns rolled from the sea, flattening trees and hospitals alike. The women crouched in caves and half-ruined field stations, pressing wet cloth over their mouths to stifle screams. Wounded soldiers were carried in on doors and stretchers, their eyes clouded with dust. The nurses worked without water, without light. They whispered sutras over the dying and prayed not to live long enough to be found. But the Americans kept coming, not the demons from their films, but shadows moving through the jungle, calling out in a language they could not understand. Hands up! Don't shoot! The women didn't know those words, but the tone, calm, firm, almost pleading, was not the roar of monsters. Still, they hid. One nurse, barely 21, pressed the glass vial against her lips as footsteps approached. Another gripped a scalpel, ready to end her life. Days passed. Hunger gnawed, thirst burned. Then came the leaflets, fluttering down from the sky like gray snow. They were printed in Japanese. Surrender. You will be safe. The United States Army will not harm women or the wounded. They read the words again and again, unable to believe them. The Empire had promised that the enemy knew no mercy. Yet here was paper proof, carried by the wind, that mercy might still exist. When the American patrols finally reached their hiding places, the women braced for death. They expected to be stripped, beaten, violated. They expected fire. Instead, a voice spoke softly through the underbrush. Come out. No harm. A flashlight beam wavered over trembling faces, sunburned, hollow, but alive. A hand extended, palm open. The women could not move. One nurse began to sob, repeating over and over, "They will kill us." The American sergeant, a farm boy from Kansas, though she could not know it, simply waited. Minutes passed like hours, until finally, one woman stepped forward. Then another. That night, they were given water, clear, cold, and endless, and bread from tin cans that smelled of oil and salt. They ate with shaking hands, staring at the men who offered it. The Americans laughed quietly among themselves, as if relieved the war had not erased all kindness. The Japanese women watched in silence, realizing for the first time that their enemies had faces. Tired, young, human. Later, in the holding area near Agate, the prisoners were placed under guard. Floodlights cut through the dark, but the air was still. The women sat together, whispering. One asked in disbelief, "Why haven't they heard us?" Another said, "Maybe they are waiting." But the waiting turned into days, and the soldiers never shouted, never struck them. It was then, under the pale light of Guam's moon, that the first seeds of confusion were planted. Everything they had been told, every story, every warning, began to crumble. The Americans did not mock them. They gave them blankets. They offered cigarettes to the wounded. The tallest of the guards, a man whose eyes looked almost gray in the dusk, even bowed slightly when handing out food. It was not the bow of submission, but of respect. The women watched in silence, unable to speak. They saw how the men moved. Strong but gentle, disciplined without cruelty. The soldiers laughed softly when one nurse spilled her ration and then helped her clean it. They even shared their canteens, letting the women drink before them. That night, when the guards changed shifts, the Japanese nurses sat by the camp fence, staring at the silhouettes of the men who had once been their nightmares. One of them murmured, "We've never seen men like this." No one replied. The words hung in the air, like incense, fragile, rising toward something unseen. For the first time, their fear began to thaw, and in its place came something unfamiliar. Curiosity. Across the camp, an American medic leaned against a post, polishing his helmet. He didn't know that the women were watching him, that every quiet movement, every patient gesture, was rewriting the stories they had believed since childhood. He only knew that war had taken too much already, and that the least he could do was be kind. And somewhere between them, between fear and mercy, the silence of Guam's night began to heal what years of lies had broken. Morning came to the camp on Guam, not with the trumpet of victory, but with the low hum of engines and the soft clatter of mess kits. Dew steamed off the barbed wire as the tropical sun began its climb. Beyond the perimeter, the sea glowed silver, indifferent to the ruin of nations. Inside, the Japanese women sat quietly, in rows, still wearing the same torn uniforms they had worn in battle. Their faces were drawn, their hair matted from weeks in the caves. None of them had yet dared to ask where they were being taken, or what would come next. To them, captivity was supposed to be a death sentence. Yet death had not come. The American guards did not spit or shout. They didn't parade their rifles like trophies or leer through the fences. They spoke softly, sometimes even joking among themselves, as if trying to ease the weight that hung in the humid air. When the women were led to wash for the first time, a ripple of fear passed through them. They were ordered, through a Japanese interpreter, to line up near a row of wooden stalls. One nurse clutched her collar and whispered, "It's starting." She thought of the horror stories she'd been told, the ones that said captured women were stripped and humiliated. But the American medics only pointed to a bucket of clean water and gestured kindly for them to bathe. Soap bars were passed down the line, white, perfumed, almost sacred in their strangeness. The nurses hesitated. Then one young woman, a girl no older than 19, dipped her hands into the water. She gasped. It was warm, hot even. The steam rose in gentle curls, carrying a scent of lavender. She stared at it as if it were a miracle. Then she began to wash. For the first time since the invasion, she felt the grit of the caves lift from her skin. She closed her eyes and let the water run down her face, her tears mingling with it. Around her, others followed. The silence broke into quiet sobs, not of pain, but of release. The American medics looked away politely, pretending not to notice, as though they understood that this small act of cleanliness was not about hygiene. It was about resurrection. Afterward, they were given khaki shirts and clean skirts from surplus supplies. The fabric was coarse but dry. Each woman folded the clothing carefully, pressing it to her chest as if holding something fragile. One of the nurses whispered to another, "They treat us like people." The word sounded foreign on her tongue. In the mess tent, the smell of food filled the air. Beans, bread, and coffee. The women were guided to benches where tin trays waited. The Americans served them the same rations they ate themselves. When one of the Japanese nurses tried to stand and bow before eating, an older sergeant shook his head gently. "Sit, eat," he said. She obeyed. The first sip of coffee burned her tongue. The taste was bitter, strange, alive. Across the table, another woman took a bite of bread, then froze. Her lips trembled. "Butter," she whispered. She hadn't tasted it in years. Her hands began to shake. A young corporal noticed and smiled, sliding a tin of jam toward her. "Good," he said, patting his stomach. "Eat good." He didn't know the words in Japanese, but the meaning crossed easily enough. She nodded, tears glistening at the corners of her eyes. That night, as the women lay in the wooden barracks, they whispered to each other about what they had seen. One said the guards smiled too easily to be soldiers. Another said they must be pretending, waiting for orders. But none could deny the softness in those men's eyes, the kind of gentleness that couldn't be faked. Outside, the guards smoked quietly, trading letters from home. One of them had a photograph of his wife holding a baby. When he showed it to a fellow soldier, he said softly, "She must be walking now." The Japanese nurse who overheard this through the slats of the barrack wall didn't understand the words. But she saw the tenderness in his face. It was the same look her own brother had when he spoke of their mother before the war. Over the next days, the routine repeated. Food, water, clean clothes. No cruelty, no punishment. The women began to look at the Americans not with terror, but with wary fascination. Some tried to study them, their height, their easy laughter, their discipline. They didn't bow, didn't shout, didn't seem bound by the same invisible chains the Japanese soldiers had worn. One morning, while tending to a small infirmary set aside for the wounded, a Japanese nurse saw an American medic treating a captured Japanese private. The soldier, delirious from fever, cursed his captor weakly. The medic ignored the words and kept bandaging the wound. The nurse couldn't move. Everything in her training screamed that it was a trick. But she saw the man's steady hands, the way he held the dressing as gently as if it were a newborn. She looked into his face and saw nothing of the beast she had been taught to hate. Only fatigue, only humanity. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, the camp took on a golden glow. The light stretched through the fence, casting long, soft shadows. The women sat on the ground, their backs to the wire, watching the guards move like silhouettes against the fading sky. They were no longer sure where the line between prisoner and captor began or ended. One nurse, who had once sworn to die before surrender, whispered, "They are not what we were told." The others were silent, but none disagreed. In the stillness, a single American guard noticed them watching. He lifted his hand, hesitated, then waved. Awkwardly, almost shyly. The women froze, unsure of the gesture's meaning. Then one of them, braver than the rest, bowed her head in response. No one spoke. The sea wind moved through the camp, carrying the scent of salt and palm leaves. And for the first time, both sides felt the same fragile thing take root, a quiet recognition that beyond uniform and language, There was a bridge. It was built not with treaties or orders, but with simple acts. A bowl of food, a warm bath, a moment of shared silence. And it was strong enough, perhaps, to outlast the war itself. In the weeks that followed, the camp settled into rhythm. Morning roll calls, meal distributions, sanitation duties, and medical care. Yet beneath the routine, something quiet and unspoken was unfolding. The Japanese nurses, once strangers to the idea of surrender, now found themselves caught in a strange borderland, not just between nations, but between identities. They were no longer servants of the empire, yet not truly free, no longer warriors, yet not yet women at peace. And each day, they watched the Americans. At first, it had been disbelief, then fascination. But now, as the hours passed, it had become something deeper, a question that refused to go away. How could men raised to fight us show such patience, such grace? They studied the way the soldiers carried themselves, relaxed yet alert, weapons slung casually, but eyes always scanning. They were tall, often sunburned, with broad shoulders and quiet voices. They joked without fear. They helped one another without order. The Japanese nurses had grown up under the iron expectation of perfection. A mistake was shame, a weakness was failure. But these Americans seemed to move without shame, to speak without bitterness, even among prisoners. One afternoon, during latrine duty, Nurse Kyoko, thin, sharp-featured, once a stern believer in Bushido, accidentally slipped in the muddy path. Her tray of washing tins clattered to the ground. She stiffened, waiting for the reprimand. Back home, an officer would have screamed, maybe struck her. But here, a corporal standing nearby simply rushed over and helped her up. He didn't laugh. He didn't even speak. He just handed her back the tins and patted her shoulder gently. Then he walked away, whistling a low tune, something that reminded her vaguely of the lullabies her mother once sang during the rice harvest. Kyoko stood there, stunned, her knees trembling, not from the fall, but from the quiet shock of being treated human. Elsewhere in the camp, Nurse Emiko had begun to notice the way one particular American guard always fed the stray dog that lingered near the fence. A scrawny creature with a torn ear, it had survived the invasion like them, skulking between tents and palm trees. The man, Private Tom McAllister, though she did not know his name, would leave bits of meat or bread near the post where he stood watch. Sometimes, he'd crouch and whisper to the dog in that strange, soft English. Not commands, but stories. Emiko watched this daily ritual with increasing wonder. She had once believed Americans loved only violence. Yet this soldier, barely more than a boy, showed kindness to an animal he had no reason to help. One evening, she asked a fellow nurse, "Do you think he feeds us the same way?" The question hung between them, and then came the answer, quiet and undeniable. Yes, but without wanting anything back. In the barracks, the nurses whispered late into the night, exchanging fragments of the Americans they had seen, the one who helped fold laundry, the one who lent a pencil for writing home, the one who sang when he thought no one listened. The guards were not perfect, of course. Some were weary, others distant. But none had become the monsters they had imagined. The propaganda had spoken of Americans who desecrated the dead, who killed civilians, who laughed as they conquered. Yet these men, these tall, dusty, quiet men, seemed burdened, not triumphant. Their eyes held fatigue, their hands carried both rifles and canteens. And when they looked at the nurses, it was not with contempt. It was with something harder to understand, respect. There was a night when it all changed for Nurse Hana. She had spent the day helping treat a wounded Japanese boy, no more than 16, who had been found half dead in the jungle, his leg mangled by shrapnel. The Americans had carried him into the infirmary, laid him gently on a stretcher, and without hesitation began to operate. Hana stood beside the American medic, handing tools, sponging sweat. The boy screamed and wept and begged for death in his fevered tongue. The medic didn't flinch. Hours later, the operation ended. The boy lived. As they cleaned the room, the American sat down heavily on a stool, wiping his brow. Hana, exhausted, leaned against the wall and looked at him for a long time. Then, without thinking, she spoke in halting English. "Why? You help enemy?" He looked up surprised, then shrugged. "Because he's not the enemy anymore." She stared at him. "He is soldier, like me." The man, his name was Daniel, nodded slowly. "You were soldiers. Now you're people who need help. That's all." He stood and walked out, leaving her with the sentence echoing in her chest. Not enemy, just people. That night, she couldn't sleep. She thought of the Emperor's face, of the flags, the slogans, the lessons drilled into her since girlhood. And then she thought of Daniel, blood on his sleeves, sweat on his face, saying those simple words. In the dark, she whispered them again. "Now you're people who need help." The words were like a stone thrown into a still pond, spreading outward, rippling, breaking the reflection she had once called truth. In the morning, as the sun climbed once again, the nurses lined up for roll call. The Americans stood in their usual posts. But now, something had shifted. Not in uniforms or weapons, but in posture. The women stood straighter. Their eyes met those of the guards. Not defiant, not ashamed. Curious, one nurse caught sight of a soldier tying his boot, humming an unfamiliar tune. Another watched as a young lieutenant handed a box of chalk to a boy drawing figures in the dirt. These small things, so easy to overlook, had become sacred. They were proof. The Americans were not what they had feared. And maybe, just maybe, neither were they. In the sky above, a gull drifted lazily on the rising air. The war still raged across the ocean, but in this place, between fences and palm trees, two worlds had begun to see each other not as reflections of hate, but as broken mirrors, finally turning toward light. The camp air had changed. You could smell it, not just in the sea breeze that swept through the trees, but in the way the women stepped onto the gravel paths with slower, steadier feet. Fear no longer clung to them like sweat. Suspicion still lived, but it had loosened its grip. The barbed wire still stood, but inside it, the distance between guard and prisoner was quietly shrinking. That change deepened on a day no one expected. It was a Sunday. The morning was quiet, the heat not yet risen. The American camp commander, a rotund, middle-aged major, with a voice like gravel but eyes that always watched gently, had granted a day of rest. No work, no drills, no inspections. Just time. And it was in that gap, in that small breath of stillness, that something human slipped in. A few of the American guards had started a makeshift baseball game near the edge of the perimeter. Using scraps of wood and an old glove, they tossed pitches and shouted friendly taunts. One of the prisoners, a younger nurse with a sharp wit named Sachi, stopped to watch. At first, she stared with a soldier's instinct, measuring their movements, their spacing, the arc of the ball. But after one particularly dramatic swing and miss that sent a guard tumbling into the dirt, she laughed. Not a cautious giggle. A full, unrestrained, belly-deep laugh. The sound startled even her. The guards paused. One of them grinned and tipped his cap toward her. She looked away, cheeks flushed with confusion. But something had cracked. That afternoon, the guards set up folding tables outside the barracks and began preparing food. Not rations, real food. Canned peaches, bread baked from local flour, roasted vegetables, even a tin of chocolate that had somehow survived the Pacific's humidity. When the women were called to eat, they came with guarded expressions. But they came. And that's when it happened. An American sergeant, his name was Harold, with wiry arms and a slow southern drawl, accidentally dropped a tin of peaches while serving. It rolled down the table and clattered on the ground. He cursed under his breath, reached to pick it up, then looked up to see the line of Japanese nurses watching him. With a sheepish smile, he raised both hands and made a theatrical bow. "My deepest apologies, ladies," he said, mimicking the most overdone, exaggerated movie-style gesture he could muster. Silence. Then one of the nurses, her name lost to time, lifted her hand to her mouth, trying not to laugh. But the moment caught her. Her shoulders shook. She broke. Then another, and another, and then all of them were laughing, soft at first, then louder. The laughter rolled over the tables like a wave. It was not a laugh of mockery. It was something else. Release, relief, recognition. Even the guards laughed, some nervously, others wholeheartedly. It had been months, years even, since most of them had heard women laugh like that. Not since before the landings, before the blood on the beaches, before the night sky burned over Saipan. For a few minutes, the war disappeared. Later that day, an impromptu lesson began. A few of the Americans had brought chalk and a slab of plywood. They started teaching simple English words: water, bread, friend, thank you. The nurses, hesitant at first, gathered around. They repeated the sounds awkwardly, mispronouncing vowels, laughing at their own mistakes. One woman wrote friend on the board, and the soldiers corrected her with smiles, not scorn. Then the nurses began writing Japanese words in return. Tomodachi, oishi, yoroshiku. The guards tried to repeat them, failing miserably. There was something sacred in the shared effort, in the vulnerability it demanded. Sachi, the same one who laughed during baseball, took the chalk and drew a simple picture. A dog, under a tree, with a man beside it. Underneath she wrote in Roman letters, "Peace." One of the guards nodded, then drew a circle around the word. Yes, by sundown, they had created an entire wall of scribbles and translations, drawings and phrases. It looked like a child's classroom. But to those who had lived in caves and crawled through battlefield hospitals, it was a monument to something far greater. Mutual recognition. The nurses returned to their barracks that night, carrying more than food. They carried the strangeness of laughter, the warmth of gestures that asked nothing in return. And they carried questions they couldn't yet answer. If these men are kind, what else have we been wrong about? The walls of the empire had been built with steel and fire, but also with stories. Stories of American cruelty, stories that said death was better than capture. But those walls had begun to crumble, not from artillery, but from the gentle pressure of peach tins and broken English and laughter under a coconut tree. That night, as fireflies drifted through the cracks in the barracks walls, Nurse Emiko whispered to Hana, "Did you see how he bowed?" Hana nodded. It was a joke, but not a cruel one. Emiko stared into the dark. "I didn't think they had jokes." "Neither did I," Hana almost said. But instead she closed her eyes and remembered the sound of laughter. Theirs, the Americans, all tangled together in the same sunlight. It was the sound of something being born, or perhaps something being remembered. Dignity, not the kind forced through obedience, but the kind returned through grace. Outside, the guards moved quietly through the night. Flashlights low, boots soft on the gravel. No one shouted, no one needed to. And in the shadow of war, for one brief day, strangers had taught one another how to smile. Names, like uniforms, had long been surrendered at the gates of war. To the Japanese women who had once worn white hospital smocks beneath the rising sun, their names had been swallowed by duty. In the heat of the Pacific, they had become numbers, ranks, appendages of an empire that prized obedience over identity. They were nurse second class, corps assistant, or simply Anna woman. The Americans, too, often moved like shadows. Boots, helmets, and rifles, indistinguishable from one another. Names seemed almost dangerous in a place built to forget who you once were. But kindness, once offered, has a way of reaching back through memory. And one day, that thread began with a single sound. It began at the morning checkpoint, when a young American private, dark-haired, no more than 20, hesitated as he scanned the daily head count. He had been told to address the prisoners by their assigned numbers. But he paused in front of one nurse, the girl who had helped carry buckets from the mess the day before. She was the quiet one, the one who nodded politely, but never spoke unless spoken to. He looked at the tag hanging from her shirt and squinted at the handwritten characters. "Your name," he said gently, tapping the paper. "What's this say?" The woman looked down, startled. He tapped again. "Name?" She hesitated. "Naoko," she said softly, unsure if it was a trap. The boy smiled. "Naoko," he repeated carefully. "Good name." Then, to her astonishment, he pointed to his own chest and said, "James." Naoko didn't respond. But that night, as she sat brushing sand from her borrowed boots, she whispered the name aloud. James. It echoed strangely in her mouth, not sharp like the commands she'd been used to. It sounded familiar, almost gentle. The next day, it happened again. Another guard, older this time, asked one of the nurses, "How do you say thank you in Japanese?" She blinked, surprised. "Arigato." He repeated it, fumbling the vowels. She laughed. He tried again. And for the first time, she answered not with a nod, but with her name. "I'm Yuki." The man smiled. "Yuki, got it." It was clumsy, perhaps even absurd. But that exchange spread like fire through dry grass. In the days that followed, names began to take shape across the camp. They were scratched onto the backs of mess tins, scribbled in chalk on the wooden benches near the latrine, whispered across language barriers with fingers pointed to chests and careful pronunciation. Kyoko, Hana, Emiko, James, Charles, Daniel. In this strange space, neither battlefield nor home, identity began to reemerge. One day, Yuki gave James a tiny cloth charm she had kept hidden since her evacuation from Kyushu. It was nothing more than thread wrapped around a slip of paper, a protective talisman sewn by her grandmother. She handed it over awkwardly, bowing slightly. James, unsure of what it meant, still received it like something sacred. Another morning, Emiko was helping reorganize the infirmary when she saw an American medic gently brushing the hair of a wounded Japanese boy. The soldier was humming, not a song of war, but something slow and sweet, without words. Emiko approached. "What is song?" she asked quietly. The medic looked up. "Old one. My mama used to sing it." He paused. "For sleep." Emiko nodded. "I sang too, for my brother." They stood there for a moment. Two strangers in a war-torn tent, both holding memories that stretched far beyond the Pacific. Then the medic did something that surprised her. He extended his hand. "I'm Thomas," he said. She hesitated only a second. Emiko? Their palms touched briefly. Not as captor and captive, but as two people who had carried too much for too long. In the following weeks, more stories surfaced. Nurse Sachi asked to borrow a pencil and spent 3 days writing the names of every woman in her barracks in Roman letters. She practiced until each name flowed like water across the page. When she handed the list to the American interpreter, she said, "Please, remember us, not numbers." He bowed his head and took it in both hands. Meanwhile, on the American side, the guards had started assigning nicknames to each other, sometimes absurd, sometimes sweet. Beans, for the cook who ruined the chili. Preacher, for the guard who read his Bible by the lantern every night. The nurses didn't understand all the jokes, but they understood the sound of laughter, and they understood that names, even silly ones, meant that someone saw you enough to remember, and in a place where no one was supposed to see the other as human. That was a quiet revolution. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the palm trees and the sky turned bruised with dusk, Hana sat by the fence, sketching the outline of a heron in the dirt with a twig. Across from her, on the other side, a guard leaned against a post, watching her draw. "What's that?" he asked. She looked up, startled, then gestured. "Tsuru." "Zuru?" he said, trying to imitate her. She smiled softly. "Crane, peace bird." He nodded slowly, then pointed at his chest. "Charlie." She touched hers. "Hana." Then silence. But not the silence of distance. The silence of knowing. That night, as the barracks creaked in the wind and the moon hung low over the jungle, Emiko wrote her name on a scrap of brown wrapping paper. She tucked it into her boot, near the heel. If she ever left this place, she told herself, she would carry that name forward. The one the Americans had bothered to ask for. The one they had learned to say. The one she had almost forgotten belonged to her. For in that name was not just sound, but memory, and healing, and perhaps redemption. Rain came suddenly in Guam, as if the sky itself remembered what it carried. It fell hard and warm in the sheets, drenching the gravel paths and drumming on the tin roofs of the camp. For the Japanese women huddled in the barracks, the sound brought old fears of caves collapsing, of wounded men bleeding in the dark, of promises of death whispered under the roar of American bombs. But now, inside the camp, the rain didn't bring fire. It brought towels. The guards arrived soaked, passing out dry khaki blankets with sheepish grins. "Sorry," one of them said as he handed Emiko a bundle, gesturing at the leaking roof above her bunk. She took it with numb hands. This was the 3rd time in 2 weeks the soldiers had offered protection without demand. No threats, no shouting, just kindness. And kindness, in wartime, is its own kind of shock. That evening, after the rain eased and steam began to rise from the damp earth, a nurse named Aiko lingered near the gate. She didn't mean to be there long. She only wanted to feel the air without the scent of disinfectant or burnt rice. But then she heard humming, a melody low and steady. She turned and saw a guard, Corporal Ellis, sitting under the overhang of the guard station, carving something from a piece of wood. The tune was unfamiliar, but his face was calm. Not the face of a conqueror, the face of a man who missed home. Aiko stepped closer. "What is that song?" she asked softly. Ellis looked up. "Appalachian folk tune. My mom sang it back in Kentucky." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled photograph. A woman standing in front of a barn, 2 children clinging to her skirt. "That's her. That's home." Aiko studied the photo, eyes lingering on the young girl. "Your sister?" "My daughter," he said, surprising her. "Name's Anna. She turns 5 next week." There was silence. Then softly, Aiko said, "You have family." Ellis nodded. "So do you." She didn't answer. Instead, she bowed her head, and the tears she hadn't planned on came quietly. It was not sadness, not quite. It was the pain of seeing the enemy with a heart. The next morning, something changed. Not in policy, not in orders, but in posture. For the first time, the Japanese nurses lined up for roll call, not because they feared punishment, but because they didn't want to be late. They brushed their borrowed uniforms clean. One even tied a ribbon in her hair, using a scrap of red thread from an old rice sack. And when the guards called their names, real names now, not numbers, the women responded clearly. Something invisible had begun to rebuild. The word dignity had no perfect translation between them, but it lived in the way the Americans knocked before entering the barracks. It lived in how they stood slightly back when speaking, allowing the women space. And it lived in the absurd, fragile moments. When a soldier tried to teach an elderly Japanese matron how to play checkers, or when a nurse offered to mend a torn American sleeve with a needle smuggled in from Saipan. One day, Emiko overheard a heated argument between two guards. Not about the war, not about tactics or orders, but about whether the nurses should be offered chairs instead of crates during meals. It struck her like lightning that men with guns were debating her comfort. Later that day, chairs were brought in. Not enough for everyone, but enough to send a message. You matter. That same week, another soldier, Lieutenant Harris, gave Nurse Hannah a book, an old worn English grammar with children's illustrations. He handed it to her gently, saying, "If you want to understand us better." She took it with trembling hands. She didn't open it for 3 days. But when she did, the first word her eyes fell upon was hope. She wrote it down again and again on scraps of cardboard, saying it aloud until it felt like breath. Hope, not as an idea, but as a thing real enough to carry. In time, the guards brought paper and pencils. The nurses were allowed to write letters, 1 page each, to the families they hadn't heard from in months. Many wept over the page, not knowing what to say. Some could not write at all and simply drew small images of the ocean, of the meals they now received, of a strange creature with a long rifle, but soft eyes. The Americans never read the letters. They didn't need to. They only delivered them. As April approached and the war in Europe neared its climax, the world inside the camp remained a quiet paradox. Outside, Tokyo still burned. Okinawa had become a furnace. But inside this fence of wood and wire, soldiers and prisoners were beginning to speak with gestures, laughter, and, now, names. One nurse carved a bird into her bunk's frame, a small crane in flight. Below it, she etched a word she had learned from the grammar book, kindness. And beside it, the word in her own tongue, yasashis. On that day, a group of the women stood at the fence and watched the changing of the guard. Not with fear, not even with confusion, but with something far rarer in war. Trust. No treaties had been signed. No flags had changed hands. But in this small camp, half forgotten by both nations, a quiet victory had already been won. It wore boots and helmets. It passed out soap and water. It smiled at strangers and offered them names. And in doing so, it built a bridge no empire could burn. It began with silence, not the silence of fear, which had once clung to the camp like humidity, thick and suffocating. Not the silence of mourning, though every woman in the barracks had buried something. A brother, a home, a belief. This was a different silence, the kind that grows when language runs out, when gestures, glances, and breath must carry what words cannot. It was during the repairs to the south fence, when Emiko was assigned to assist a group of American engineers. She was not a builder. She had never held a hammer in her life, but they needed hands, and she had hers. The work was simple. Hold the post, pass the nails, keep balance. But the interaction between her and the soldiers was anything but simple. They did not share a tongue, but they shared heat, sweat, and rhythm. One of the soldiers, Corporal Leland, a tall man with weathered skin and a quiet demeanor, noticed her struggling with a board. He didn't correct her. He didn't shout. He simply stood beside her, lifted the other end, and nodded once. Together, without speaking, they completed the task. Later, as they rested in the shade, Leland took a knife from his pocket and began carving a small block of wood. It was a heron, elegant, mid-flight, wings folded. He handed it to her with both hands. "No speak," he said slowly, tapping his chest, "but this." Emiko took the bird, held it, nodded. That night, she placed it by her bed like an altarpiece. Others gathered to look. The quiet among them swelled, not empty, but full. Full of things they could not yet say. Gratitude, confusion, wonder. The next day, another nurse drew a simple picture on the chalkboard outside the mess. A sunrise over a hill, and beside it, a figure holding a tray. Underneath, she wrote in shaky Roman letters, "Good man." No one needed translation. From there it grew. The nurses began leaving sketches near the fence, a bowl of rice, a flower, a boot print. The soldiers responded in kind, doodles of dogs, of home, of guitars. No formal exchange, no orders, just a conversation written without grammar. Hana, who had once led her squad of nurses with iron discipline, began to study the English grammar book every night. She practiced syllables under her breath, repeating phrases again and again. "Where are you from? Do you have family? I am nurse." Simple phrases, but like pebbles placed carefully across a river. She approached Sergeant Miller one evening after the camp's final roll call. "You, wife?" she asked hesitantly. Miller blinked, surprised, then smiled. "Yes, her name is Margaret. She writes every week." He reached into his breast pocket and carefully unfolded a photograph. A woman in a dress, standing in a wheat field, her hair tied back with a ribbon. Hana looked at it for a long time. "Beautiful," she said, the word crisp but warm. Miller grinned. "She'll be flattered." A pause. "You, husband?" he asked gently. Hana's eyes lowered. "Dead, 1942. Miller said nothing, just nodded slowly. Then, in the silence that followed, something passed between them that no treaty could replicate. Recognition, not as soldier to soldier, not even as guard to prisoner, but as two people holding broken pieces of a world that had once promised them safety. More moments followed. When Sachi fell ill, the guards moved her to the shaded infirmary without waiting for orders. A nurse from the American side brought her cold water and sat beside her until the fever broke. When an American guard accidentally knocked over a laundry line, he returned with rope and helped hang it again. Awkwardly, but sincerely. When a storm flooded the West Path, the nurses volunteered to help dig drainage trenches. They were not ordered. They simply showed up, hands wrapped in cloth, faces calm. One day, a crate of Red Cross parcels arrived. Inside were blankets, canned meat, stationery, and, unexpectedly, bar soap shaped like flowers. The nurses stared at the items in disbelief. To receive something beautiful during a time of ugliness was almost unbearable. The guards distributed the parcels without ceremony. But they did not miss the way some women clutched the soap to their chests like relics, or the way one nurse began weeping quietly over a single folded towel. It wasn't about the objects. It was about what they meant. "We see you. You matter." Later that night, Lieutenant Harris walked past the barracks and found a drawing pinned to the wooden wall, done in charcoal on scrap paper. It showed two bridges, one cracked and broken, the other newly built, spanning the same ravine. Underneath was a single word in perfect English: peace. Harris stood there for a long time. When the next morning came, He addressed the prisoners personally. A short speech, translated slowly by the camp interpreter. His voice was steady. You are no longer our enemies. The war still goes on. But here, in this place, we have made peace before the war has ended. There was no applause, no fanfare, only bowed heads and tears. In the barracks that evening, Emiko passed the heron carving to Hana. Keep it, she whispered. It brought the silence, and the silence brought peace. Outside, the moon carved its path across the sky, silent and slow, and on the soil of Guam, beneath wire and watchtowers, bridges were being built not of steel or stone, but of glances, drawings, and carved birds, of silence and understanding. The paper was coarse, lined with faint blue strokes, and smelled faintly of salt and oil. It had been torn from an old shipment of medical inventory, now repurposed for something far more fragile than bandages. Memory. Hana stared at the sheet in front of her, unmoving. The pencil she held felt heavy in her hand, not because of its weight, but because of what it was about to unlock. They had been given permission, finally, to write home. One letter, one page. Censored, of course, but their words, their hand, their voices reaching beyond the war. For many of the women, this moment brought confusion, even fear. What was home now? Was there still a village standing in Nagasaki? Was her mother alive? Would her brother, last seen on a transport to Leyte, ever read what she wrote? And what exactly could she write? Dear Father, I am your daughter, the nurse who surrendered. I am fed, clothed, and watched over by Americans. The very thought felt like treason. Still, she wrote, Father, I do not know if this letter will reach you. I do not know if our village still exists. But I am alive. I eat rice and beans. I have seen things I was never told to expect. The enemy smiles. The enemy bows. The enemy shares. She stopped. Tears dotted the edge of the page. In the next bunk, Emiko was writing too. Her hand moved slowly, carefully forming the characters her mother had taught her as a girl. She described the camp, the routine, the food. She mentioned the soap, the bandages, the sun that felt like fire on some days, like a blessing on others. But then she paused. Should she tell the truth? Should she say that she no longer feared the Americans? That she admired one for how he cared for a stray dog? That she had watched an American soldier lower his head respectfully as a Japanese prisoner died? That she had stopped believing in monsters? She set the pencil down. Her hand trembled. Nearby, the guards walked quietly between the rows of bunks, not reading, not intruding. One of them paused near Hana's bed and, seeing her distress, stepped back without a word. Even silence now had become an act of respect. The letters were collected 2 days later, tied in bundles, and sent toward whatever future waited. Not all would be delivered. Some would be lost, some censored into oblivion. But that was not the point. The point was that they had written. They had spoken at last for themselves. A week later, something unexpected arrived in return. Mail from home. One of the nurses, a girl no older than 18 named Yuki, received a postcard with her brother's handwriting. He was alive, somewhere in the south. His message was brief, guarded, but it said the one thing that mattered. We wait for you. She collapsed onto the floor, sobbing. Her fellow nurses crowded around her, not to hush, not to command her to be strong, but simply to hold her. And through the chain-link fence, one American guard stood watching, cap in hand. When he saw the tears, he bowed his head, not as a victor, but as someone who understood the gravity of good news in a world too full of sorrow. Over the next weeks, letters continued to pass. Slow, sporadic but steady. The nurses began writing for others who could not, shaping words for older women, for those whose hands trembled too much. And in the evenings, they would sometimes gather in quiet corners of the camp to read aloud the lines they dared to share. One letter told of a family who had fled Tokyo before the bombings and now lived among relatives in the hills. Another simply said, "We thought you had died. We burned incense for you. Now we will stop. Now we will wait." But one letter, one never sent, became something else. Hana had written it on the back of a medical chart, folded it carefully, then tucked it into her blanket. It was addressed not to her family, nor to a friend. It was addressed to the Emperor. "Your Majesty, I write as your servant. I believed your voice when it told us the enemy would be cruel. I believed my life would end before surrender. But I have not died. I have lived. I have been treated with dignity. I have seen your enemies feed orphans, tend to the wounded, and bury the dead with respect. I do not know what to believe anymore. But I do know this. The world you described is not the one I have seen." She never mailed it, but she showed it to Emiko one night, as the fireflies flickered beyond the slats of their barracks. Emiko read it in silence, then folded it again and kissed the corner. "Keep it," she whispered. "One day, maybe the world will need it." One day. For now, the women carried their truths quietly, in their chests, in their fingers, in their growing ability to meet the gaze of their captors without fear. One morning, during roll call, the American interpreter addressed them in halting Japanese. "We have heard from headquarters. The war is not yet over, but you are to remain here, in peace." The women didn't cheer, they didn't cry, they simply bowed. And for the first time, the guards bowed back, not as conquerors, but as men who had shared rain, letters, silence, and a growing sense that kindness could live even in places where language had died. In her bunk that night, Hana opened her folded letter once more. She didn't rewrite it. She didn't destroy it. She simply placed it beneath her sleeping mat, like a seed pressed into soil, waiting. The radio was the first to speak of endings. The guards gathered around it one afternoon in early August. The Japanese nurses weren't told what it said, not directly. But they saw the expressions change, the way the soldiers stiffened, how some slumped in their seats, hands pressed to their mouths. Others simply walked away in silence. That night, no one sang. No guitars, no humming. Just wind and whispers carried from the outer posts. 2 days later, the interpreter came to the barracks. His voice was even, but he did not lift his eyes from the ground. "Hiroshima has been destroyed." The words dropped like lead. No details, no numbers. Just that. One name, one city, gone. Some nurses gasped. Others sat down without realizing it. A few wept for the friends, cousins, or classmates they might have lost. But for many, the truth took days to find them. Because how could a city vanish? How could the sky do that? Then came Nagasaki, and then the Emperor's voice. They were gathered beneath the central awning. The guards, the nurses, the interpreters. The radio crackled with static, and then the impossible. The voice of a god, broken and human. He spoke not of defeat, but of endurance, of cessation of hostilities, of suffering too great to continue. But the nurses knew the war was over. Their war, the one that had begun with schoolyard salutes and rationed rice, that had sent them sailing to foreign jungles, taught them to kill infection and swallow fear, was done, and yet the camp did not erupt. There was no riot, no cheer, no collapse, only a stunned, echoing stillness. In the hours that followed, the guards began to take down the wire barriers. Slowly, not all at once. The fences remained, but the strict lines between them and us had become suggestions. A few of the Americans shook hands with the nurses. Some offered words they didn't understand, but felt. Words like home and finished and brave. And then, one morning, the flag changed. It was subtle. The American flag, which had always flown just above the guard station, was lowered and folded. In its place, a Red Cross flag was raised. Neutral, human, no nation, no enemy. That act, more than any announcement, told the nurses what they needed to know. They were no longer prisoners. They were simply women waiting to go home. But what was home? The questions began to rise like steam from wet ground. Would they be sent back to families who had believed them dead? Would they be punished for surviving? For surrendering? Would they be called traitors, or worse, forgotten? Some of the women tried to ask the American officers when they would be repatriated. The answers were vague. Ships had to be arranged, transit points cleared. Many ports in Japan were still rubble. But there was no anger, only apology. They were safe. They would go home. Eventually. So the women waited, not with dread now, but with a quiet ache that resembled grief. One afternoon, Sergeant Miller approached Emiko with a wrapped package. Inside was a pressed blouse, a skirt, and a pair of white socks. Civilian clothes, he explained. Not army. Yours. She touched the fabric, fingers trembling. They were soft, clean. Hers. The American guards began preparing their farewells in small, awkward ways. One soldier carved a row of tiny paper cranes and left them outside the women's barracks. Another passed around a notebook and asked the nurses, through scribbled translations, to write their names. No numbers, no ranks, just names. Some of the nurses added flowers next to their names. Others drew their hometowns in tiny maps. A few included one word in English. Remember, the night before departure, the camp held a final meal. Nothing special, just beans, rice, and canned fruit. But the atmosphere felt like a wake. Soldiers who had once been shadows now shook hands, bowed, clumsily saluted. Private Ellis, the one who had carved the heron, gave it back to Emiko. She tried to refuse, saying, "Yours." He smiled and pointed at her heart. "No, always yours." That night, under a moon heavy with memory, the Japanese women lined up quietly with their bundles. Some carried drawings. Others, letters never sent. A few brought only the clothes they had worn when they arrived, now stitched, mended, altered by care. As they passed the camp gates, the American guards stood at attention. They did not salute. They did not shout. They simply bowed. One by one, the nurses bowed in return. And then something remarkable happened. Yuki, the youngest, stepped out of line, turned back toward the camp, and raised her hand in a small wave. Others followed. Not all, but enough to leave the Americans stunned. Because in that moment, the war truly ended. Not with surrender, not with bombs, but with a gesture that asked nothing and offered everything. Farewell. It was not the end of suffering. The journey home would be long. Some would return to ash, others to silence, others to shame. But they had walked through the valley of death and emerged with names intact. And they had seen that even kindness can wear boots. Even mercy can carry a rifle. And even the enemy, with time and truth, can become the one who walks you to the gate and wishes you peace. The journey home began not with fanfare, but with dust. The trucks rumbled into camp before dawn, headlights dimmed, engines rumbling like distant thunder across the hills of Guam. The American guards didn't shout orders. There were no roll calls, no barked commands, just quiet gestures, respectful nods, and the weight of things unsaid. The nurses gathered their few belongings, folded blankets, wrapped letters, the handmade keepsakes they had been too afraid to believe they could keep. One by one, they stepped into the light of the trucks, their shadows stretching behind them like long threads. They didn't look back at first. But as the first engine coughed and rolled toward the coast, Yuki, small, serious, no longer a girl, turned and raised her hand once more. The wave was slower this time, not hesitant, but ceremonial. A farewell not just to the camp, but to the selves they had once been inside it. And from the gate, one guard, Ellis, the quiet carver, stepped forward and saluted, not as a soldier, as a friend. The sun broke slowly through the trees as the convoy made its way to the harbor. The island receded. The war, too, receded, not in maps or newspapers, but in hearts that had been rebuilt in silence. No one spoke much on the ship. Some slept. Some stood against the railing, watching the vast Pacific roll away beneath them like pages turning in a story they were no longer sure how to read. Hana sat near the bow. Fingers curled around the carved heron once given to Emiko, now passed to her. In her lap lay the folded letter she had never sent to the Emperor. She didn't need to anymore. The truths she had once feared to speak were no longer secrets. They were memories. And memories, she had learned, do not need permission to survive. When they arrived in Japan, it was not the land they remembered. The cities were hushed, buildings missing teeth like old men after battle. Train stations stood scarred, and people moved like shadows, thin, quiet, hungry. At the port there were no crowds, no flags, only silence, and the low clatter of transport carts moving across wood and mud. Still, someone waited. Hana stepped off the ship and saw a man standing just beyond the checkpoint. Thinner than she remembered, stooped slightly, but unmistakable. Her uncle. He had raised her after the fever took her parents. He didn't run to her, didn't cry. He simply bowed, long and deep. She bowed back. It was enough. Other nurses found similar moments. Mothers who clutched them as though they'd returned from the dead. Brothers who stood speechless. Neighbors who wept openly, but not all homes welcomed. One woman was met only with silence. Her brother refused her, ashamed, he said, that she had lived while others died. Another found her house reduced to ashes. A third returned to find no one at all. Even peace could wound. But they carried something now they hadn't before. The memory of kindness from strangers who had no reason to offer it. And that was enough to rebuild. Years passed. Some married. Others remained quiet, drifting between towns, tending gardens, or teaching children. A few never spoke of the war again, not out of shame, but because the words could never match the truth. But some, like Emiko, Hana, and Yuki, chose to remember aloud. In small gatherings, they shared their stories not as soldiers, but as witnesses. They told of men who had once been enemies, who brought them soap and medicine, who bowed, who laughed, who offered pencils instead of punishment. They spoke of names spoken gently, of carved birds, of drawings on walls, of a world they saw being born in the shadow of a dying empire. One winter, Hana was asked to speak at a local school. The children were shy, fidgeting, unsure why an old woman was being asked to speak. She told them of the camp, of the Americans. But weren't they the enemy? One boy asked. Hana paused, looked out the window. Snow fell gently on the plum trees. They were, she said, and then they weren't. The boy frowned. How does that happen? She smiled. When you're given food, when someone treats your wound, when they say your name, not your number, that's how it happens. War tells us we must become monsters to survive. But sometimes, even in war, people remember how to be human. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the carved heron, held it up. This, she said, was carved by a man who never learned my language. But he gave me this, and I understood what he meant. The class was silent. That night, Hana returned to her home, a small wooden house near the base of a hill, where the trees bowed in winter wind. She placed the heron on her windowsill, beside a photograph of nurses in uniform and a folded American grammar book faded by time. And as the fire cracked in the hearth, she sat and watched the mountain. It had burned once, during the air raids, during the years when her heart was filled with fury and fear. But now, its slopes were green again. Crops grew, children played. The fire had gone, but the mountain remained. That, she thought, was the lesson. Wars rise and fall. Flags change. Empires crumble. But dignity, quiet, stubborn, humble dignity, endures, even in enemy hands, even behind barbed wire, even when the world says it should not. And as the wind shifted outside her window, she whispered a word not in Japanese, but in English. Soft, careful, but true. Peace.